Sailing Alone Around the World by Captain Joshua Slocum. A sleepy summary. Close your eyes and let yourself drift, because this is the story of a man who drifted slowly, wonderfully, across every ocean on the face of the earth, and the story is old and quiet and full of salt wind and the sound of water sliding under a wooden hull in the dark. It begins, as most great stories do, with something that seemed like an ending. A man without a ship, a sailor with nowhere to sail. And then, out of a muddy New England pasture, a boat. Joshua Slocum was a man of the sea in the oldest and most complete sense. He had been born in Nova Scotia in 1844, in a little village called Annapolis Royal, tucked beside the tides of the Bay of Fundy, where the water rises and falls so dramatically that you can walk on the bottom of the ocean, and then, an hour later, watch it vanish beneath 40 feet of cold green water. He grew up knowing the smell of brine before he knew the smell of much else, and the rhythm of tides got into his blood early, the way things do when you encounter them in childhood. He left home at 16, already restless, already drawn outward, and spent the next several decades crossing and recrossing the world's oceans on square-rigged sailing ships, working his way up from ordinary seaman to mate to captain, eventually commanding his own vessels, trading along the coasts of South America, fishing in the cold Pacific off Alaska, sailing between ports in the Far East and the islands of the Pacific. He was, by any measure, one of the finest practical sailors who ever lived. But the age of sail was ending. Steam was taking over. The great merchant sailing ships that had given men like Slocum their careers and their identities were being replaced, one by iron-hulled steamers that didn't care about the wind and didn't need the kind of knowledge that a man spent a lifetime accumulating. By the early 1890s, Slocum found himself stranded, not at sea, but on land, in the unfortunate and somewhat bewildering position of being a master mariner without a ship to master. He was in his 40s, his finances were poor, and the world he had known and loved and been very good at was simply disappearing around him. It was in this condition that a friend, a whaling captain named Eben Pierce, offered him a boat. The gift was not, perhaps, as straightforward as the word gift implies. The boat was called the Spray, and she was sitting in a field in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, which is not the typical habitat for a sailing vessel, and she had been sitting there for some years, and she looked it. She was a sloop, old and tired and rotten in many of her planks, her hull soft in places, her masts and rigging long since removed or collapsed. She looked, in short, like something that belonged in a field and probably intended to stay there. But Slocum looked at her and saw something else. He saw a project. He saw, perhaps, a purpose. What followed was 13 months of the most painstaking, solitary, and ultimately triumphant act of rebuilding you can imagine. Slocum taught himself the fundamentals of shipwright work as he went, cutting new timbers, fashioning new planks, caulking seams, bending new frames into place over a fire he built on the beach. He sourced materials wherever he could, sometimes salvaging wood, sometimes buying it, always fitting piece to piece with the patient attention of a man who had no particular deadline and no particular place to be. The Spray that emerged from this long process of resurrection was 36 feet, 9 inches long, with a beam of 14 feet 2 inches wide and sturdy, built more like a work boat than a racing yacht, comfortable and stable rather than fast and sleek. She was, Slocum would later write, the right boat for what he had in mind, which was nothing less than sailing her around the entire world alone. The idea of a solo circumnavigation was not merely ambitious in the 1890s, it was widely considered impossible. No one had done it before. The ocean is large and the watch schedule is unforgiving when there is only one person to stand all the watches, and a ship must be steered around the clock. And what does a man do when he needs to sleep? His friends and acquaintances received the plan with a mixture of admiration and gentle worry, the kind of worry that people extend to someone who has announced he is going to do something that might kill him. Slocum received their concern politely and went ahead and departed anyway, leaving Boston on April 24, 1895, at the age of 51, in a boat that 3 years before had been rotting in a meadow. He sailed first down the coast, stopping at various ports along the eastern seaboard of the United States, making small adjustments, getting the feel of the spray in open water, discovering her virtues and her eccentricities. One eccentricity he discovered early and delighted in throughout the voyage was that the spray had an extraordinary tendency to sail herself. On most points of sail, Slocum could lash the wheel or set the sails in a particular configuration and walk away, and the boat would hold her course for hours without any human hand on the tiller. This was not magic. It was the happy coincidence of the boat's hull shape, her rig, and the balance between sail and keel, but it felt like magic, and it would prove essential, because without it the voyage could not have been made. A man cannot steer for weeks on end without sleeping. He stopped in Gloucester, then in Newport, where the wealthy yacht club set regarded his little sloop with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. He stopped in New York, where he gave lectures about his planned voyage and was received with the kind of polite public interest that sometimes precedes genuine astonishment when the thing being discussed actually comes to pass. He provisioned, he rested, he wrote, and then he pointed the spray south and east toward the open Atlantic and the coast of South America. The Atlantic crossing was a long dream of steady trade winds and rolling blue water. Slocum was a keen and observant man, and his account of the passage is full of small wonders, the color of the water changing as he crossed into tropical latitudes, the schools of flying fish that scattered before the bow and sometimes landed on the deck in the night, the stars overhead in a sky untouched by any shore light, impossibly dense and bright in a way that people who live near cities have entirely forgotten stars can be. He ate salt provisions and canned goods and whatever he could catch, and he read books that he carried in a small library below decks, and he talked to himself, and sometimes he did not talk at all for days, and this was fine too. He arrived at the Azores with a sunburn and a healthy appetite, and there his narrative takes one of its most charming detours. A man on one of the islands gave him a large wheel of white cheese, and this cheese would later feature in the story in a way that Slocum found educational. Not far after leaving the Azores, he decided to fry a large quantity of plums in butter and eat them for dinner, which he did with enthusiasm, and subsequently spent the night in tremendous gastric distress. convinced at times that he was dying, rolling around the cabin while the Spray, true to her character, sailed calmly onward through the night, perfectly unconcerned. By morning he felt better, and by the time he reached Gibraltar he had concluded that the plums and butter combination was to blame, and also possibly the cheese. He would be more careful with cheese in the future, or at least more careful with the combination. Gibraltar was lively and full of sailors and soldiers, and the general bustle of one of the great strategic choke points of the world's oceans. Slocum enjoyed it, received advice from various naval officers, and was warned most seriously not to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean was at that time plagued by pirates and Moorish corsairs operating out of the North African coast, who would certainly take his small sloop and possibly do worse things besides. Slocum thanked them for the warning and sailed into the Mediterranean anyway. He encountered no pirates, explored briefly, and then turned back, concluding that the Mediterranean route to the east was not the right path for him, and that he would go the long way around, which meant south down the Atlantic coast of South America and through the Strait of Magellan. The run south down the Atlantic was beautiful and eventful in the way that long ocean passages are eventful, full of weather changes and wildlife encounters, and the slow, meditative rhythm of day following night following day, the miles accumulating beneath the hull with a patience that matches the patience of the sea itself. He stopped along the Brazilian coast, at Pernambuco, and then at Rio de Janeiro, where he was received warmly and gave more lectures about his voyage. The Brazilians were fascinated by the tiny boat and the solitary captain, and they fed him well and showed him their city, and Slocum found them charming and said so. Further south he went, past Buenos Aires, into the cold grey waters, where the South Atlantic begins to feel less like the ocean you know, and more like the preamble to something wilder and older, and less interested in human convenience. The pampas wind came screaming across the flat Argentine coast, and the sea grew rougher, and the sky took on that pewter quality that belongs to high southern latitudes, and Slocum sailed on through it, his little boat plunging and rising, spray flying, the rigging humming its cold song. He arrived at the Strait of Magellan in the late southern summer of 1896, and here the voyage entered its most dramatic and terrifying chapter. The Strait of Magellan is one of the most difficult passages in the world, a long, twisting channel between the southern tip of South America and the islands of Tierra del Fuego, buffeted by ferocious williwaws, which are violent gusts that come shrieking down off the mountains without warning and can knock a vessel flat in seconds. The channel is also very narrow in places, the currents are treacherous, and the weather changes constantly and violently. It is not a passage that forgives carelessness or inexperience, and even for experienced sailors with full crews, it is a serious and frightening place. For a single man in a 36-foot sloop, it was something else again. Slocum entered the strait with great care and considerable respect. He anchored often, choosing protected coves to wait out the worst weather, sleeping when he could, watching the sky with the attention of a man who knows that the next squall might be the one that finishes him. He had encounters with the indigenous Fuegians, the Yargan people who had lived in those harsh channels for thousands of years, and who were, by Slocum's time, a diminished and troubled remnant of their former numbers, their culture and population devastated by the diseases and disruptions that followed European contact. Slocum's account of them is a product of its era, not entirely free of the condescensions of late Victorian thinking, but it is also observant and occasionally sympathetic, and he clearly found them interesting. He was warned about the Fuegians, told they would steal anything that wasn't nailed down, told that he must stand watch at night or lose his gear. He took the warning seriously and devised a remarkable precaution that deserves to be remembered among the more creative solutions to nighttime security in the history of long-distance sailing. He scattered carpet tacks on the deck of the Spray before going to sleep. When, deep in the night, a party of Fuegians came silently alongside in canoes and began to climb aboard, the results were exactly what he had hoped for. The barefooted thieves hit the tacks, the night exploded with howls and curses, and the would-be boarders retreated in disarray to their canoes and paddled away with considerable speed, not inclined to try again. Slocum slept well afterward. He spent months in the strait, pushed back by contrary winds, waiting in harbors, making forward progress, and then losing it again to the relentless westerlies that blew in from the Pacific. He finally got through, not entirely without incident, and emerged into the Pacific Ocean on a day when the wind was from the wrong direction and the sea was rough. And then the wind shifted to a severe pampero that drove him so far south that he found himself nearly at Cape Horn itself, in the most notoriously dangerous waters in the world, at night, in bad visibility, alone. He survived it, which given the circumstances was not a certainty, and got himself back into the strait, and eventually found a way through to the Pacific proper, bruised and tired, but intact. The Pacific was a revelation after the terrors of the strait. Slocum picked up the southeast trade winds almost immediately, and they carried him northwest in a long, gentle curve toward the islands of Polynesia. The wind blew steadily and warmly, the sea sparkled, and the Spray sailed herself day after day while Slocum read and wrote and watched the ocean, and marveled at how thoroughly the Pacific rewarded the patience it demanded to reach it. He had the boat balanced so perfectly that he could leave the helm for hours at a time and go below to sleep, emerging to find her still on course, the compass needle pointing faithfully in the right direction. He stopped at the Juan Fernandez Islands, which are famous as the place where Alexander Selkirk, the real-life castaway who inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, was stranded in the early 18th century. Slocum found this intensely interesting. He wandered the island, imagined Selkirk's years of solitude, and thought about what it meant to be alone in wild places. It is one of the quietly moving passages in the book, a man who has chosen solitude, stopping to contemplate a man who had it thrust upon him, and finding in the difference something that matters. Westward across the vast blue body of the Pacific he sailed, and the days became a long, sun-drenched dream of blue water and trade winds, and the slow parade of clouds across a sky so enormous it makes every human concern seem very small. He had been at sea long enough now that the rhythms of the ocean were entirely natural to him, and the rhythms of shore life, the noise, the crowds, the complications felt distant and slightly unreal. He was in his element in a way that few people ever get to be in theirs, and his writing from this part of the voyage has a quality of contented wonder that is lovely to read. He arrived at the Marquesas Islands in the summer of 1896, and from there worked his way west through French Polynesia, stopping at Samoa, where he visited the home of Robert Louis Stevenson, who had died 2 years before but whose widow Fanny still lived at Vailima, the beautiful estate on the slopes above Apia. Slocum was received with great warmth. Fanny Stevenson gave him a packet of navigational charts and a bag of pilot bread and a general welcome that moved him genuinely. He had been an admirer of Stevenson's work, and the visit to the place where the great storyteller had lived and died and been buried gave the whole Pacific crossing a kind of literary consecration that pleased Slocum enormously. He visited Fiji and then Australia, where he spent an extended period on the eastern coast, giving lectures in Sydney and Melbourne and various other cities, being feted and celebrated and fed proper meals by people who were astonished and delighted by his voyage and his boat. Australians took to Slocum with particular enthusiasm. There was something in his combination of practical competence and quiet adventurousness that matched their own self-image, and he gave dozens of lectures and received hundreds of visitors aboard the Spray and generally had a fine time. The Australians, he wrote, were the most hospitable people he had encountered anywhere in the world, which is the kind of compliment that tends to endure. From Australia, he crossed the Indian Ocean, which is a large and somewhat temperamental body of water, neither as reliably pleasant as the Pacific trade wind zones, nor as dramatically terrifying as the Southern Ocean, but capable of producing its own serious weather and its own challenges. He stopped at the Cocos Keeling Islands, a small cluster of coral atolls in the middle of nowhere in particular, where he found a small population of Malays descended from the original settlers and a British resident director, and a general atmosphere of tropical quiet that he found restorative. The people there had never seen a sloop quite like the Spray, and they regarded Slocum with the mixture of respect and pleasant bewilderment that had become, by this point in the voyage, something he was used to. He crossed to the island of Rodriguez, and then to Mauritius, and then to South Africa, making his way in the steady rhythm of long ocean passages and island stops that had structured the entire voyage. At the Cape of Good Hope, he spent some time, the southernmost point of Africa, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet in cold and sometimes furious water. He was well south of it now, heading for home, and the thought of home, though he had been away so long that he was not entirely sure what home meant anymore, began to organize itself in the back of his mind. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope without the drama that Cape Horn had provided, which he accepted with gratitude, and turned his bow north into the South Atlantic once more, that same ocean where he had first set out 3 years before. The familiarity of it was both comforting and slightly strange. He had been around the world. He had crossed every ocean. He had navigated the most dangerous waters and the most remote corners and the most gentle and sun-drenched passages. And now he was heading north in the Atlantic again, and ahead of him somewhere was New England and a harbor, and people who would be astonished and pleased to see him. He stopped at the island of St. Helena, that remote scrap of volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, famous above all as the place where Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled after Waterloo and where he died in 1821. Slocum found St. Helena fascinating. He visited the house where Napoleon had lived and the room where he had died, and the place where he was originally buried before his body was removed to France. He thought about Napoleon at some length, about what it meant to be the most powerful man in the world, and then to end your days on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean, staring at the sea you could not cross. There is something quietly pointed about Slocum's meditations here. He himself was a man who had chosen the ocean as his freedom, and he was looking at the evidence of a man for whom the ocean had been a cage. From St. Helena, he sailed north to Ascension Island, another volcanic speck in the South Atlantic, and from there continued north toward the Caribbean. The weather was fine, and the trade winds pushed him along comfortably, and the spray moved easily through the blue water in the way she always did when the conditions suited her, which was most of the time. She was, Slocum had concluded by now, the finest sea boat he had ever been aboard, and he had been aboard a great many sea boats in his 50 years of sailing. He touched at Trinidad, the southernmost of the Caribbean islands, and from there worked his way north through the island chain, stopping at various places, Grenada, St. Lucia, Antigua, enjoying the warm air and the bright colors and the unhurried pace of Caribbean island life. The Caribbean has a quality of golden ease that makes it very easy to stop in and very hard to leave, and Slocum lingered there longer than his navigation plans strictly required, which was the right thing to do. He had earned some lingering. He was now in the final stretch of the voyage, the last ocean miles between him and the harbor he had left 3 years before. He had sailed roughly 46,000 miles. He had done it alone. He had navigated by sextant and chronometer, and the deep instinctive knowledge of the sea that he had spent 50 years accumulating, and he had not lost his vessel, had not lost a single man, there being only one man to lose, and had come through storms and doldrums and pirate warnings and carpet tack adventures, and cheese-induced gastric crises and near capsize in the waters south of Cape Horn, and he had done all of it with a quality of calm, interested attention that is one of the most admirable things about his character. He made his way up the eastern seaboard of the United States in the autumn of 1898, 3 years and 2 months after his departure. On June 27, 1898, the Spray arrived at Fairhaven, Massachusetts, the same town where the voyage had begun, where the old sloop had sat in her field awaiting resurrection. Then he sailed on to Newport, Rhode Island, where he officially ended his circumnavigation, and the harbor was full of boats that came out to greet him, and there were people cheering on the docks, and it was, by any measure, a triumphant return. He had done something no one had ever done before. He had sailed alone around the world. There is a quality to what Slocum accomplished that goes beyond the physical achievement, extraordinary as that achievement was. The physical facts are impressive enough: 46,000 miles, 3 years, 1 man, 1 modest boat, but they don't quite capture what the voyage actually was, which was a sustained act of attention. Slocum paid attention. He paid attention to the wind, and the sea and the sky, to the people he met in every port, to the history and culture of the places he visited, to the behavior of marine animals and the behavior of his own boat, to his own thoughts and moods, and the way solitude changes a person's relationship to the world. He was curious about everything, and this curiosity gives his book, which he wrote afterward, a quality of aliveness that makes it a pleasure to read even now, more than a century after it was published. The book came out in 1900 and was an immediate popular success. People loved it for the obvious reasons, the adventure, the drama, the simple and extraordinary fact of what he had done, but they also loved it for less obvious reasons. They loved his voice, which is dry and wry and occasionally very funny, the voice of a man who takes himself seriously enough to do extraordinary things, but not seriously enough to be pompous about them. They loved his way of noticing things, the small, precise observations that anchor every passage and make the reader feel present on the deck of the Spray. They loved, perhaps above all, his essential sanity, the quality of a man who went around the world alone and came back not deranged or broken or transformed into something strange, but simply himself, a little more weathered, a little more assured, satisfied in the way that a man is satisfied who has done exactly what he set out to do. He wrote about the loneliness honestly. There were times, especially in the long mid-ocean passages, when the solitude pressed on him in ways that were not comfortable. The human animal is a social creature, and the complete absence of other human beings for weeks at a time is not a natural condition, no matter how independent a person believes himself to be. But Slocum found his own ways of managing it: the books, the writing, the deep engagement with the work of sailing, and occasionally, in moments he reports with a certain bemusement, the sense of company provided by the boat herself. The Spray was a good companion, steady and responsive, and the relationship between a sailor and his vessel is not entirely unlike other important relationships in its combination of dependence and trust, and the occasional frustration that comes from cohabitation. There is a famous passage in the book in which Slocum, near the beginning of the Atlantic crossing, is sick from the plums and butter episode and lying in his bunk below decks, while the Spray works her way through rough weather, and he looks up and sees a man at the helm. The man is swarthy and dressed in old-fashioned sailor clothes, and he identifies himself as the pilot of the Pinter, one of Columbus's ships, and says he has come to steer the Spray through the storm and see her right. Slocum, feverish, watches this apparition until he falls asleep, and when he wakes the storm has passed and the boat is on course. He treats the whole episode with characteristic equanimity, not insisting on its literal truth, but not entirely dismissing it either, letting it stand as one of the remarkable things that happen to men alone at sea who are slightly delirious from bad plums. It is one of the passages that people remember longest from the book. He was a gifted writer as well as a gifted sailor, and the combination is rarer than it ought to be. He had very little formal education, having left school at 16 to go to sea, but he had read widely in the tradition of seafaring literature and natural history, and he had the natural writer's instinct for the precise word and the concrete detail. He does not purple his prose. He does not inflate his danger or his heroism. He simply tells you what happened and what he saw and what he thought about it, and the restraint of the telling makes it more vivid, not less. When he writes about the storm off Cape Horn, the understatement is more frightening than any amount of dramatic elaboration would be. When he writes about the beauty of a Pacific dawn, the simplicity of the description is what makes it beautiful. After the voyage, he was famous, genuinely and widely famous, in a way that few people achieve without seeking it. He gave lectures across the United States and in England, received honorary degrees, was visited by admirers and celebrated in newspapers, and generally occupied the position of a national hero, which he accepted with good grace and a certain amount of private amusement. He was not a man who confused fame with worth, and he knew that what he had done was remarkable, but also that what made it remarkable was not the fame but the thing itself. The 46,000 miles and the 3 years and the one small wooden boat and the one man who knew how to handle her. He continued to sail. That needs to be said, because some people who do extraordinary things use them up and live off them forever, but Slocum was not like that. He was a sailor. The sea was where he lived, in the most complete sense of the word. He bought a farm on Martha's Vineyard, which he farmed in the winters, but the summers always called him back to the water, and he made coastal voyages and offshore passages, and kept the Spray in good order, and kept himself in good order aboard her. He was well into his 60s, by the standards of his era a very old man, but he moved like a younger man on a deck, quick and sure in the way that the sea teaches people who pay attention to it. In 1909, at the age of 65, he departed once more on a long voyage, intending to sail to South America, and perhaps beyond, perhaps around the world again, perhaps wherever the wind suggested. He left Vineyard Haven in late November. The weather was cold and the season was late for offshore passage making, but Slocum was not much moved by such considerations. He had been offshore in November before. He had been offshore in every month and in every condition imaginable, and he was not afraid of the sea in the way that people who have spent less time on it are afraid of it. He was respectful of it, which is a different thing. He was never seen again. The Spray and Joshua Slocum vanished somewhere in the western Atlantic, and no trace of them was ever found. He was declared legally dead in 1924. The sea that had given him his life, his career, his great adventure, his fame, his identity, the sea took him back at the end, quickly and completely as the sea does. There was no wreck found, no debris, no final message. Just absence where a man and a boat had been. It is a fitting end, in a way, though fitting ends are cold comfort when you love someone. He died as sailors die when the sea takes them, without ceremony, without explanation, without even the dignity of a known last moment. The ocean does not explain itself. Slocum would have understood that. He had spent his whole life dealing with a force that operated entirely on its own terms, that rewarded preparation and punished carelessness, but also sometimes simply acted without reference to either. He had been lucky for a very long time. Eventually, the luck ran out, as it does for every sailor who goes far enough and long enough. But the book remains. The Spray, or a replica, exists in various forms in museums and in the imaginations of sailors around the world. And the voyage itself, the 46,000 miles, the 3 years, the one man, the boat that sailed herself through tropical nights under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The voyage itself is permanent in the way that great human achievements are permanent. It happened. Joshua Slocum sailed alone around the world when no one had ever done such a thing before, and he did it well, and he wrote about it beautifully, and then he went on sailing for 11 more years until the ocean took him. So close your eyes and let the story settle into you like the sound of water under a boat in the dark, that steady, soft rhythm of passage, of miles accumulating, of the horizon always fresh ahead. Think of the spray moving west across the Pacific on a January morning in 1897, the sails full and drawing, the compass steady, Slocum asleep below decks in his bunk with his boots off and a book open on his chest, the boat sailing herself through the blue immensity, the trade wind gentle and sure, the flying fish making their small bright arcs across the bow wave, the world very large and very quiet and very much at peace. That is the heart of this story. That is what Slocum found out there beyond the last sight of land, in the solitude and the blue distance and the steady pull of the wind. Not danger, not heroism, not fame, though all of those were there too. Just the world as it is when you are paying attention to it. Just the sea and the sky and the little wooden boat going on. Sleep now. The watch is set. The course is true. The wind is fair and the stars are out, and somewhere out there the spray is still sailing. Somewhere between the life it lived and the story it became, moving through the dark water toward a dawn that is always just about to break.